Thanks for the opportunity to come and talk to you, and thank you to Tony for giving us an introduction to wayfinding. I'll also like to provide sort of a bit of background to the sort of process of wayfinding, the sort of cognitive steps people go through in navigating through space. Wayfinding really, in definition, is a technique where landmarks, signage, pathways, environmental cues are used to help visitors navigate and experience a site or place. It was initially coined by Kevin Lynch in his 1960 book Image of the City, where he defined wayfinding as the consistent use and organisation of definite sensory cues from the external environment. The notion of wayfinding and navigation through place is one of our most fundamental human skills. Here, Lynch distinguishes landmarks, nodes and paths and regions within a city, all of which have importance for pedestrian navigation. Structures that Lynch described have proven their relevance over the last 30, 40 years, and the basic concepts behind many of our wayfinding systems and navigation systems today. In the early 1980s, the notion of wayfinding was expanded to include signage and other graphic communication elements. And in more recent time, there's been a definite push towards an integration of wayfinding within other urban treatments. And now there's an interesting push towards sort of integration of wayfinding within GIS technologies and things. And I'll cover a little bit of that as part of my talk. So, where are we? I'll just start with some images, and again, you've already seen some of the systems that Tony was showing a little earlier. Wayfinding is everywhere. Every city, many even small towns have their own wayfinding system, and only even a sort of cursory review will show that there are so many different typologies, symbol approaches. I've just sort of put a few here in terms of some urban wayfinding systems, and again I'll elaborate on those further as we go through. Some successful and some not successful. Even in sort of coastal and riverside environments, there's different systems adopted of the sort of traditional pointer finger type signs, digital displays. I mean, this one's up at Marysville, a live interactive wayfinding system that also includes information about when the mountain is full in terms of ski season times. City of Melbourne and Docklands Authority, this is a suite of signs that they developed some years ago, plus, as Tony mentioned, this is some zoo signage that we've found in particular useful, even though I think the font on that one's fairly small. There's Adelaide Zoo. So really, fundamentally with wayfinding, there's effectively two streams, I suppose, and the first one is the passive wayfinding, which is something that you do intuitively. So it includes those range of natural qualities or cues within a particular place or environment that you use intuitively to navigate through space. So it's things like sight lines to a destination, external reference points, or objects that help to locate ourselves. And in Hobart particularly, you've got the mountain, you've got the water. It's a particularly easy city to sort of navigate around because your benchmarks, even though there's topography and there's lots of individual hills and things, you've always got those reference points. And in a well-designed city, in a lot of the early settlement cities, you'll still find the elements are located in logical sequences, and often on logical things that you intuitively understand. So you can find the church, you can find the town hall, you can find the central squares without too much signage. But the problem falls down though when those cues, those sort of passive cues, aren't sufficient to help navigate a city. As Andrew mentioned, as our cities grow, the need for intervention in assisting wayfinding becomes more important, and that's where the whole notion of active wayfinding comes about. So I'll look particularly at active wayfinding, but what that's not denying is that there is always an importance of design when working in an environment to look at what those natural cues are, those passive cues, and understand those before you actually insert any extra elements that may be redundant, because I think, as Tony mentioned a little earlier too, excessive provision of elements actually becomes clutter, as opposed to necessarily assisting. If I'm either a confusing message or urban clutter, which actually makes things even worse. Common wayfinding tools. So signage is obviously the sort of default setting for many wayfinding systems, and consistent material use. Colour, typography, so the sort of font and consistent use of that. Navigation systems, and I'll run through a number of suites of signs as an examples of how that may work. The use of symbols in lieu of words is a short way of communicating a message, so steps or parking signals and things, obviously they're very easily understood. Even the simple directional arrows can help. Probably less commonly used tools for wayfinding, but again, incredibly important are things like lighting, having defined paths defined through adequate lighting, and it doesn't necessarily mean over lighting, but it means lighting that's going to help assist in direction. Embedded art elements is something that I'll have some examples of that later, where creative integration of art can be actually add to a sense of place, it can add to navigation. Surface treatments and consistent use of pavements or use of something on the ground that may actually help people navigate. The use of sound and accentuating even sights of sound is another tool. And there's a whole notion of tertiary treatment, such as pavements, furniture, and other urban elements as being part of a consistent suite that assist in navigation and understanding of the city. Wayfinding considerations. Working with those passive wayfinding cues, as I mentioned earlier, is fundamental. So what are the existing natural built cues, and which of these can assist in navigation? And that's the key, is really to work with those first, and then only at that point would you need to sort of start considering what elements to add. Viewing distance and spacing, providing clear sight lines to decision points is critical as well. So, really ensuring that elements are spaced correctly, not too far apart, so that people get lost in the interdistance. They're not too close together that they become just too repetitive. Considering circulation and pathways and decision points. So, and again, I'll give an example of that in a moment, where a project that we were involved with, that we actually analysed the city and the way it worked, and where those critical decision points, those nodal points were, as being the opportunities to place those elements, and considering how people are moving within the place, whether it's coming off public transport or coming from car parks or just pedestrians walking through, and actually sighting elements critically at those points. Critically, even more important again, is where those points overlap, so understanding where those where people might come together in a particular location, and then what sorts of information they need. Another one that I've been particularly pushing for is that connection to existing place. So assessing the physical characteristics of the site and locality, and applying as a designer, again, careful consideration of things like scale, details, material, colour, so you can reinforce that connection to the place, rather than potentially importing something that might be foreign, an element that may look good in a style manual or a guide that you've seen somewhere else, but really, if it doesn't have a connection to the place or some relevance, then it's not really, in my opinion, it's not really an appropriate solution for that site. Going backwards. There we go. Some key considerations. So consider materiality, the sign, the message, the nomenclature, the hierarchy. Keep the style consistent, and even if the hierarchy changes and steps down depending on the viewer or the visitor, it's just, and you saw a good example of that in that London example, that was really a classic way of the materiality being carried right through. consider the users, and again that London example was really good in terms of adjusting the information, the way the information is presented to cater for the needs of all user groups. Text and typography, the font, the style, the size are all critical, and as is the use of an integration of symbols. Working with your client within your client protocols, and I don't know if I think there's obviously quite a few people in the city of Hobart here, but how strict the people are with your corporate style guide. But we find that that's often something that we have to integrate within a signage suite. But it is also something that shouldn't dictate. It shouldn't be the driver, because there is already so often that's something that people understand as being part of the city, but it can be easily dismissed if it's too tightly restricted to that corporate suite. It's just seen as another piece of council's branding. So while elements need to actually sit within that in some way, they also might need to actually twist elements of it or integrate elements of it in a way that makes it a little bit more engaging and more creative. And again, I've got some examples of how we've done that in the past. Another key consideration is using multi-use elements, and really that's all about trying to work with the existing infrastructure, poles, armature, anything that walls, pavements. If you don't have to add another element, then you can actually integrate it within the elements that are there within a place. Other important things are considering the physical characteristics of the element that you're designing, so the size, the shape, the material, the mounting. Materiality is key too to ensure that these elements have a longevity, because a lot of this sort of infrastructure is placed in urban areas where you've got graffiti, or you might have weathering, coastal conditions, lots of factors there that need to be considered when you're really getting down to the sort of fine detail of what these elements may be made of, in addition to where they'd be placed. Again, you'll see some examples of a family of elements, which is often an appropriate way of developing a solution for the range of messages that need to be told. And then I've already covered that one about multi-use elements. I'll just focus through some examples. First of all, City of Melbourne. These are this is the current City of Melbourne suite of signs. That was actually the previous suite, and there's still a few of those around the city. What the city design strategy section there have developed is a series of very simple blade signs. It's nothing, this is sort of not world-beating, it's very basic, but it's actually very effective and very connected to their tourism industry, their tourism operators. They've worked with understanding where people are going, what the key destinations are, what the movement patterns would be, and mapped all that out. So they've got a system, and they've actually got, this is their full suite of information pillars. They starting with their primary information hubs, which are actually an armature for a lot of their communication. So there's a lot of relay, a lot of electronic equipment contained within those that relate to other aspects of the city. So they've designed an integrated stainless steel cylinder that also contains the key information. So the highest element of these are touchscreens, so people can go up and find out where they are, and then they can find out what elements that are in their general locality or what they're looking for. The issue has been the technology. There has been issues with the technology in the rolling out of these elements, and people have moved back to the actual static map. However, I think, as Tony mentioned before, that whole heads-up notion, there's actually someone in the City of Melbourne who designs these elements and actually reorientates their 3D CAD model of the city and generates the view actually of the direction you're going with, based on the actual location. They then have secondary information hubs, which are the smaller ones. They have their freestanding blade signs, which are these ones here. They still do have their pole-mounted directional signs, and they're always mounted on an existing piece of infrastructure, be it a tram support pole or a light pole. They then have their wall-mounted elements and their multiple tenancy signs, and that's often related to City of Melbourne assets and infrastructure or sporting facilities. So they've got, for what is a massive municipality, they've actually got a very tight, consolidated suite of urban elements. There's just elaborating on some of the design of their information pillars. And there's an example of how that map would work. I don't know how clearly you can see that, but there's always the sort of "you are here" element, and that is, then there's the 3D map. And they have found the 3D map, for people who aren't from a sort of design background, who don't deal with maps and plans every day, they find that a sort of oblique view helps people to understand and navigate space far better. Other treatments that I'll run through. This is that whole thing of not adding an element if you don't need to. There's an existing piece of infrastructure. This is City of Port Phillip, some work in South Melbourne, that they don't have signs mounted on poles. Actually, have used the bins, and they've got different colour coding as to whether it's a street name, which is Bank Street in this case, and then Albert Park Lake and Southern Cross Station is a directional signage on those, but they also have integrated their wayfinding signs with some interpretive signs around history. So simple blade signs in the street, locating, directing you to different elements within the precinct, but there's also, for those who want to find out more information about the history of the place, there's also a lot of information there as well. This is some recent work, aspects done along the Merry Creek Trail for, I think it was parts of Victoria, that crosses a number of municipalities, and again it's integrated. There's one sign element at a key junction point that, along the creek, and there's a very confusing, I don't know if many of you know the Merry Creek, but there's a lot of pathways coming in, feeding into the open space network, and it's very easy to get lost. So there are the overarching kind of directional signs up high, pointing you to the main destinations. There's something locating you in place where you are at that actual point, and then there's a map that shows where what's within the immediate radius. In addition to that, there being the sort of what you can and can't do in that area signage. So it's quite an integrated type little suite. Similarly, this is some work that David Lancashire did for us out in Warrandyte along the riverfront there. Directional signage, but also integrating interpretive signage. This one was on the Heidelberg School Artist Trail, but also incorporating elements around what can and can't occur in that area. Again, I think this one was David Lancashire design as well. This is Hobson's Bay, picking up on that, the use of local materials, wharf timbers down at Altona. Key directional elements are picked up. Navigation marker references obviously up the top, and then components of heritage and interpretive design integrated within it, and then larger elements contained along the route as well. This one's in New Plymouth in New Zealand, and again a very, this one I think was it's an 18k path walk, and the whole notion of connection to the waterfront and navigation system has been built on through the use of a large illuminated pole that's got you can't actually see there, but there's a red marker on the top of that pole, the use of the recycled wharf timbers, and very robust, I think they're actually zinc wrapped maps that show you where you are at each location, and then what the key destinations are along that route. And that's been, that is part of a very successful project that also incorporates art, where there's incrementally pieces are added, and a very extensive network system of bridges and pathways. This is some work that, our practice actually got into wayfinding and interpretive signage through our work in urban design areas, and we've been working at the City of Shepparton on open space and urban projects for a couple of years, and they, in parallel, were engaging graphic designers to work on signage for the municipality, and we're finding that these elements, although they might look good on paper, that a lot of the elements weren't actually connecting when they were reeled out and put on the ground. These elements often were, the scale was not quite right, the placement was often, and the resolution of the detail, the connection to the ground was often fairly ordinary, and there was becoming a sort of clutter of extra pieces that weren't integrated with their furniture or any of their other elements. So we were given the project, of actually rolling out their consolidated urban design manual, which included things like bus stops, seats, bins, cafe screens. It was a really, it's probably a 100-page document of their sort of what to do in the city. And they ended up giving us the signage component as well, and the wayfinding component, and that was really as a way of ensuring that the treatments were all fully integrated. And since that one, we've actually then done, I guess, probably 10 or 12 other similar scale suites that are fully consolidated urban design manuals and signage manuals. This was one that we did for Box Hill, and a little bit like Tony mentioned earlier in terms of understanding the place and the environment you're working. This one we really mapped all of those key nodal points. So the red's the transport hubs, yellow is the education facilities, blue are the retail shopping, green's the sports, and then the civic was orange, medical centres and the hospital facilities were in blue, arts and culture were the pink. We understood then, and because we were actually already designed the mall in this area, we then looked at taking some of that urban design elements and actually bringing those out, and the mall and the station being the focal point for that particular municipality. The 400-metre ring, which is that area there, which was about a 6-minute walk from the centre, and then the 1,000-metre is the light blue, which is about a 15-minute walk. So that was the sort of Box Hill Central area mapped. And then we looked at where those elements, so again, the crossover, the sort of merging or meshing of any of those nodal points became the really critical points to place elements, and it's probably very hard to read there, but we ended up coming up with a suite for, this one actually went down to pedestrians, cyclists and motorists, because we were actually trying to designate or define the pathways to car parks, or the entrances to car park or parking areas as well. So. And that one then had to deal with a higher speed environment of the 60k Marina Highway route that passed right through it. So that was really loosely the family of signs that we designed, and it's kind of metaphorically it's linked to the chopsticks. It's a really high Asian precinct now. It's become a real hub for Asian. So the sort of 2-minute noodle. The noodle box concept actually came out as being one of the elements we used to as the inspiration for the signage, and that follows right through. We then did, after that one, we then did a similar piece of work for the city of Darebin, where we were looking at their corporate suite, and they had a number of, each shopping centre within the municipality had their own mapping system, they had their own retail approach to signage, and we actually were able to come through and do a sort of clean sweep and actually introduce a level of consistency, which helps a lot for a lot of reasons in terms of not just the sort of maintenance and ongoing management of the systems. It actually helped give the city a greater level of consistency. So we started doing the town hall precinct, which was sort of some mapping around their shire office, city offices, which are actually located not at the front on High Street, they're actually located around the back. So the sort of passive wayfinding cues were pointing people, they were walking to what used to be the main entrance to the town hall, but innately, unfortunately, they'd actually been, the office has been moved around, so we introduced a whole series of subtle elements, little buttons within the pavement that directed you from, so the person at reception at the old town hall could say, "I'll just follow the bronze discs around to Gower Street to find the entrance." We do have these sort of, again, simple blade signs, anodised aluminium, a map, and the basic information and directions about where people need to go. But that then followed through to the actual precinct signs for the buildings themselves, the civic centre, customer service centre, and again using that, this one we really pushed council's corporate style manual and took the bird out, and it actually, again, we were given really tight restrictions on the colour that we had to use and the way it had to be represented, and it had to be council standard. In the end, we convinced them that wasn't really going to wasn't going to satisfy. It was going to be just seen as another part of council's strict brand, we needed this to be something a little bit above that, and that's when we actually set the bird in punch metal, and it's actually in an acrylic. It's coming off the panels. It now flows right through. Even their park signs have this approach. Their main entry signs in from the municipality, we've got these 4 metre high signs at each of the entrances. The library signage, so it's now it's been fully rolled out. As a smaller project though, we also did some work in Northcote, which was really funded by DPCD, the planning department within state government, that had recognised the need to improve connectivity from train stations up to main strip shopping centres. And High Street Northcote is it's a really quite it's an artsy community, and it's something that we couldn't again refer or roll just use signs. We really wanted to actually embed elements of a sense of place or the character of that place and that community within the suite. So the last thing we wanted was signs. In the end, we ended up we had to have a sign because that was on the funding application that council, when they put in the funding application, they said it would include signage, but the actual signage elements are probably the least significant of the lot. We ended up running a workshop with people, residents in the area, with traders and with local artists, and that was really around trying to understand how people navigated from the train station to High Street, and defining what those paths, the desirable paths were, because the main alternative path, the obvious path, actually is a very tight pedestrian space, a sort of 1.5 metre wide footpath with very narrow carriageways. So by us promoting the use and the connection via the laneways and via the 2 minor streets was actually seen as a positive thing. So we ran the workshop, we identified what the issues were with the existing space connections. So it was poor lighting, it was poorly defined routes. You actually could go a number of ways and we're never sure if you were actually going the right direction. Potentially the best link was a laneway that was very poorly surfaced, very dark, and you didn't know if it was actually going to take you through to your destination. Once you got to your destination, you were actually coming into a car park, and then when you got to the car park, you had to actually walk through an arcade to get you through to High Street. So we had so many barriers that we really needed a sort of multi approach. In the end, we again challenged the notions of sort of road connections, and the traffic engineers freaked when they saw these because they thought that we were subverting the pedestrian crossing where people were going to get run over. In the end, they actually came around. What doesn't come out of these photos is actually, this was intended to be quite playful and quite fun, but they're actually the depth created by the black, the white and the yellow dots actually has a sort of 3D image, so you walk towards it and it's like these dots are hovering. We also introduced these what are called pavement markers. We worked with a local artist, Helen Bodycomb, to cast discs within the pavement, and she took because we're going through very intimate little workers' cottages streets, she took 2 notions that are really quite foreign but combined them together in an interesting way. She took the doily of the sort of the miners' cottage, the sort of old-fashioned sort of lace doily, and then overlaid it with SMS text technology, the sort of shortening of the language around SMS technology, and brought the 2 together and cast those in the pavement, which we put I think they're about every 8 or 10 metres that take you from the laneway connection to the station. And you see people sort of rubbing them and trying to understand what they all mean, but there's no sign that explains what they all mean. But I still think it's actually interesting in its own way. And some of them have lizards on them. She's picked a number of different elements. We did introduce a sign and fell back on the old pointer sign that this was nearby in Carlton, that whole sort of pointing the finger, that's the way to go. Integrated the brand that Northcote had developed, the traders had developed around the sort of logo of Northcote, and a simple steel, very robust though, it's on about 10mm thick plate steel with the facade of High Street actually cut into the top of it, and then that information again orientated to the way that you're looking. with the time zones also indicated on as well. So you are here and then 10-minute, 5-minute walking increments, and the key elements map, the train station, shopping centre, the high street. So that was about $150,000 project. 2 of those signs plus pavement marking, lighting. That was really quite good. And the laneway, we resurfaced, we actually fully rebuilt the laneway as well. This is a project that's not one of ours, but it's actually one by a firm that we work very closely with now, and it's part of Rouse Hill development in New South Wales, which is north-western Sydney, about 40 kilometres out. And that was a new city that they were developing, voters were developing on a golf course site, and they needed wayfinding to actually also become placemaking. So they came up with a notion that the interpretive designers came up with a notion of 4 key themes around, I think it was settlement, orchard growing, sort of Aboriginal history and discovery, I think, were the 4 broad notions. They then colour-coded those precincts, and that was within the first stage, which was a commercial shopping centre, but that's since flowed out to the whole municipality. So this suburb has actually been branded through, and the wayfinding tiers down. So all of the elements that were developed as part of this initial strategy now have formed part of the wayfinding suite for the whole city. So that was the sort of the Aboriginal history element, and those panels, these ones are actually very large panels that were used within the shopping centre, but elements of those then fed subsequent signage systems. So that's the Explore, Discover, Settle. And you can see this one was next to the travelator within the department. So I think it was a 200-metre long super graphic. And all of these were notions connecting it back to place. So again, the interpretive designers had done a lot of background research on understanding what this place was and had been, and actually ran a lot of workshops with the local Aboriginal community on what they wanted to see in there. And in the end also incorporated a lot of the elements, the found objects, the archaeological elements that were discovered during the construction process were actually used as part of this whole wayfinding set. That's the quadrant around orchards. The same firm, in fact, what we found with our wayfinding work and our urban design work is that while we were really good at designing urban design elements, furniture, seats, signs even, what we probably weren't as good at was the integration with materiality, so really pushing the boundaries in terms of our materiality, and the sort of getting right down to the fine level of the sign, the typology, and the interpretation. So we've ended up working a lot with a firm called Arterial Design, and as you'll see in a minute, that their approach and ours align very closely. So we've been able to move some, challenge some interesting, work through some very interesting projects as a collaborative that solo neither of us would have actually been able to achieve the sort of results. This is their current work for Australian Garden Stage 2. And again, they rolled out, which is opening next Saturday, I think, they rolled out a whole an integrated suite of elements for the Botanic Gardens. Glazing, cut steel, and again, that's picking up a lot of the materiality, the sort of core 10 look that Taylor Cullity had introduced as part of the landscape design. That's fed through down to the signage. This is actually going backwards, this slide. The Fraser Coast work they're currently doing is similar, has a similar thing where it has the at Hervey Bay with the maps and the interpretive signs embedded within it. So depending on the visitor, if they really only want to navigate their way from point A to point B, that the salient information is contained on there. But if there is an interest in more information, there's actually information, in this case it's on the whales. This one is a similar suite for Bendigo Botanic Gardens, and again, as Tony mentioned, often sites that are fully contained, like a Botanic Gardens or a zoo, it's easier you actually get the opportunity to start afresh often and develop a fully integrated suite, and you can take a step back and start to work with what are the character elements of a place. And with this one, Arterial then looked at topography, the setting of the Botanic Gardens, and came up with a colour scheme and a suite that actually built on a lot of the elements. So obviously it was beyond just the botanical references. There are elements of location, place, history all embedded within it. So this was an analysis diagram they did in terms of the understanding of the local topography, and the gardens are located within a gully. That then flowed through to their sort of graphic element, their sort of symbol, their sort of extraction of that then flows through to the colours, and you can see that element flowing through onto these signs. But that then influenced the form and the colour palette for the signage suite. That then flows through to the actual wayfinding signs within there. Don't look too hard. I actually found a typo in the heritage area. I hope it wasn't built like that. So then there's their family of signs going through, right down to plant ID signs. So it was a fully consolidated suite. This piece of work's actually won quite a few awards for interpretation, because it really did take a sort of top-down approach, but also it considered that the most basic element within botanic gardens being the labelling of plants, and integrated even elements for kids the ribbon, the kids' design themes, interactive panels, and the sort of format panels as well. A lot of the work they've done in other projects too, like this type, has involved sound, so there's either hearing impaired people, assistance for them, in addition to potential integration of soundscape elements as well. This is some work that we've done in collaboration with Arterial Design, and this, as Andrew mentioned, we've done a lot of work in Marysville in the last, well, we've been working there for about 6 or 7 years, but in the last 3 years since the fire, we've actually been responsible for the redesign of all of the streetscape and many of the park spaces in the town. And again, one of the responses to the fire was for people to help, from the council sort of default setting was to really try and add signs so people would understand not only the fire, but how the town was before the fire. And there were a number of pieces of work that were happening around us that we could see that were really not that well connected or coordinated, and that the result of which was going to be more and more information overload that people weren't necessarily going to be reading, take the time to read, because there were AO panels mounted in the street explaining what the old guest houses may have been in the town, but it really wasn't. It was just too much of it, and it was often poorly located, and there were lots of things wrong with it. So we actually encouraged them to take a while. Actually, before they even got to fabrication, they'd been designed. We encouraged the sort of removal of a lot of that potential clutter, and to try and look at techniques where things could be integrated within the street, within the pavement, within just without adding signs. So the one place that we actually did the most work was in a park, which is next to the information centre, and that's the point that the key paths town walks leave from. And we've adopted this sort of approach of the Hansel and Gretel, the breadcrumbs. So we don't have any signs at all, but we have lots of little cues that help lead people off onto these various walks. And each of them is based on themes around some connection to the place. So either plants, the local animals, in this case it's the barred galaxia, which are a rare and endangered fish that live in the creek, the history of the town in terms of its timber history, its gold history, or the guest house history. So through casting of bronze elements or the glass, we use a lot of techniques with digiglass, where images are actually embedded into the glass and set into the paving or set into the wall. We're actually able to help people sort of navigate through space, and it means that it makes it more interesting for people to come back to. It's a site that you can come back to many times and you'll see a different story or understand a different element. And it's many layered, so you can spend a small amount of time there or a lot, and you'll get a different a message that might be a different message or an additional message to the one you picked up last time. We did have to have DSE then came and added their layer of signage, and unfortunately that needed, despite trying to get them to put it on the wall of the information centre, they ended up insisting on a shelter. So we just designed a very simple shelter in the street, which contains the sort of relevant information on the trails, but then that's the last sign and the only sign of that type in the town. the last project I'll talk about was actually less about wayfinding. It's probably more about embedded interpretation, messaging within a site. It's a bushfire memorial that we've just done for the community of Strathewen. And that was a place that I think out of the 220 people in the town, they lost 29 lives. And what we've done there is really design a landscape, a setting that is, and there's no signage. It's actually a community memorial located within a bush reserve, well away from a car park, and it's only just been opened in the last couple of weeks. But what we've used there is told the story of the fire through effectively a haiku poem. We ran workshops, we ran a series of workshops with the local community where they brought their personal reflection or story of the fire and then turned that into basically a 10,000 word haiku poem that is arranged and embedded within the installation itself. So there's, it's all aligned around large teardrops, so there's 4 of these large circular elements, and within each of those elements there is a story that's embedded within it. It's all sandblasted sandstone, and the main ring is the sort of events that occurred on the day. The inner ring is the actual lives, the names of those lives that were lost, and we've got a sort of polished stainless steel dome that reflects the sort of natural amphitheatre of the bush around you. And then the other stories that are embedded within that are stories of support, and that sort of community support that came from the CFA and all of the people that helped on the day and after the fire. And then the story, the last one is the story of renewal and the future of the town. So the one I didn't mention was on the way in is the sort of Strathewen before the fire. So there's a 700 metre walk that you come past, you understand what Strathewen was before the fire and how it came about. And then you come into the event, and then the whole thing unfolds. So, yeah, although it's not directly wayfinding, what it is, it's really that embedding of story, text, narrative within a site. Because it's sort of fundamental to what you've been doing. I think that's it, Andrew. I probably won't need to run through these. These are really the cues that we've talked about before about reinforcing the space and working with place and community. That's it.